Welcome to the All Out Coach Show. My name is Tim Mikhelishvili. I'm your host, CEO, and co-founder of Pharma, an analytics and organizational change consulting agency that helps life science companies improve their performance and engagement. As I look back at the All Out Coach podcast, now it's in its third season, I think of it as a catalog of ideas first and then leaders who challenge the normal, conventional modes of communication, who redefine how performance is measured, and also who create learning and development communities and opportunities for others. Today, I have a special guest, Peter High, who's the president at MetaStrategy, a premier advisory firm that helps many executives, chief information officers, chief technology officers, integrate their data culture, data transformation into their enterprises and their customers as well. MetaStrategy offers business, international growth, and merger and acquisition strategy related services. Peter High has been a columnist at Forbes for over 10 years. He is the host of the earliest and longest running technology podcast called Technovation, where he's interviewed many of the top tier leaders from across the organizations that all of you know. He's interviewed the Mexican president as well. He's a keynote speaker who talks to large global audiences, best-selling author of 3 books. His latest book is called Getting to Nimble: How to Transform Your Company into a Digital Leader. And today, I'm excited to have Peter speak to us and help us make sense of what digital transformation really is, to have this discussion and to make it relevant to all of us, regardless of our industry and our field. So, Peter, what a pleasure it is to have you on my podcast. First time I learned about you was at a LinkedIn learning course that I took about a year ago, where you shared a lot of those specific examples which brought to life data science, data mature companies, and data transformation. And that really inspired me to share it, to review it, and summarize it for my audience as well here on All Out Coach across social media. So I'm really glad to discuss digital transformation and its relevance and deconstruct its different elements as well. Thank you for being here today.
It's my pleasure, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Yes. We speak about the organizational transformation, but I thought we'd start with your personal transformation throughout your career. Share with us what your personal transformation and professional transformation has been like over the years.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think probably the key moment for me was starting a business. So a bit more than 21 years ago, I founded MetaStrategy. You were kind enough to mention them in my company in the introduction. And, the entrepreneur's journey was really in many ways the clarion call for me and the difference maker in my professional career. I was 27 at the time, and in many ways, an ideal age to start a company. I was not yet married, nor did I have kids. I've done all the above since then. So I was relatively unencumbered and in a position in life to be able to take a risk, and with just enough experience to have some confidence. I had a reasonable network for somebody at that age, certainly nothing like today. And a little bit of runway to work with. I was not independently wealthy, but I'd socked enough away to be able to have some runway to coast down, to try to make a go of it as a business leader under my own banner. And I would say that's been the biggest difference maker for me as I think about my own personal transformation. So much has come from the fact that I've had the liberty to shape a company. The blessing to have phenomenal colleagues. Some of my most senior team members have been with me for a decade and a half or more, and an opportunity to explore ideas and to bring those to bear in a variety of different ways, whether it's like you and your great podcast, delivering it through podcast form or in the written form in books or in my Forbes column, certainly in the advising of a number of technology executives as well. And then I had the good fortune, frankly, 21 years ago to hitch my wagon to one of the fastest growing parts of the economy, which is enterprise technology. And so that's a good dose of luck, quite frankly. It happened to be where my experience was, but thank goodness that was also what I chose in terms of, where to focus my attention. And the prominence of technology and digital leaders since then has grown remarkably. And so we've had the good fortune of growing with that. And I like to think having some influence on that growth at the same time.
Yeah. In my industry, which is very conservative and highly regulated in pharma and in the medical division, which I'm familiar with, we are realizing the need to integrate that data culture and data transformation into our organizations because our ecosystem is becoming so competitive. In an organizational transformation, the level of risk and reward are probably magnified exponentially, and innovation takes courage and risk, as well as sharing possibly sensitive information publicly, including with competitors, I think. So you speak to many chief information officers and executives in IT departments. How does a chief information or data officer enable a company in a highly regulated industry, such as finance, for example, or pharmaceuticals, to stay competitive and relevant despite its restrictions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say in many cases, it's the technology and digital leaders who under them have cybersecurity, for example, which is one of the important, I always say, unfortunately, growing in prominence areas of organizations as a result of the sensitivity of what you're describing and the need, of course, to first and foremost do right by the data and ultimately the customers of organizations like a pharmaceutical company is producing their pharmaceuticals for. So ensuring that data and all of the most sacred aspects of what the business holds dear are in fact locked down is a key element of what the IT leadership team can do. And if they do that well, that then provides more room for experimentation and for innovation. Look, innovation does require risk taking. To use a baseball analogy, you're not going to, if you are batting 1,000, if you're getting a hit every time, you are not innovating. And so it also means hopefully inculcating an organization that may have a general conservatism for the various reasons, important reasons that you note, inculcating that culture a little bit with some risk, a risk tolerance that allows for pursuing ideas that do not have definitive answers on the other end. And I mean, in some ways, actually, pharmaceutical organizations are great bastions for this, given the amount of time it takes and the number of tests and ideas that need to be put forth in order for a blockbuster drug to be introduced. So in many ways, it's IT reflecting the very nature of the business in some ways. And boy, I mean, is there an industry like the one that you play in that has more of a necessity to stand on the shoulders of and leverage data and information and experimentation that has happened in the past, such that the wheel is not reinvented time and time again. And again, that comes back down to things like knowledge management, of course, and an ability to draw out information in the most in the easiest way to understand this new vein of experimentation I'm going on. How much has already been settled that I can leverage? How much has already been research has been done or work has been undertaken that I can build upon, as opposed to going back to ground zero each time. I think the technology and digital leaders have a great role to play in that. So on the one hand, it's one of the complications in any industry of this role, frankly, Tim, is that you have to have, on the one hand, a risk mitigation aspect to what you're doing in the form of, for example, cybersecurity, while also allowing for a risk tolerance, a risk taking, which is the very essence of innovation. And so the best CIOs understand that balance implicitly and hopefully get that right for the long term, such that the organization will succeed.
The CIOs also bring a particular global perspective that's relevant across different ecosystems. And I think you discussed that, the importance of an ecosystem in your book, Getting to Nimble. So how does the ecosystem of a business impact its competitive power?
That's a great question. So, I mean, for so long, we've thought about the competitive landscape being Coke versus Pepsi, or Ford versus General Motors, or American Airlines versus Delta, sort of major players who are do very similar things, who are pitted against each other. When in reality, increasingly, given the complexity and the global nature, as you point out, to business, it requires an ecosystem. That competition, therefore, is ecosystem to ecosystem rather than company to company. Who are you harnessing and bringing to the party, so to say, in order to accomplish all that you need to do? And this is in the form of, I mean, just to use a few examples of many we could come up with together. This is in the form of joint ventures or managed service providers that we use. It could be the leveraging for scaled organizations, leveraging partnerships with venture-backed companies, and in fact, the venture capital community itself to understand where developments from an enterprise technology perspective might impact my company differently from others in my industry, so long as I'm riding those trends appropriately. Again, just to name a few of many. So it requires thinking differently about how you are harnessing those resources in order to accomplish all that you do. Look, I mean, the other thing I talked about the balance before between risk taking and risk mitigation a moment ago. Likewise, I think it's important to understand what are the things that we need to undertake within our four walls with employees. And oftentimes, again, I'll generalize here to make the point, but those things that are most strategic to the organization are likely to be the ones that are best suited to being developed by employees of the organization, holding that information closely and being the drivers of that change. I'm not saying that there's never an outside force or an ecosystem player that would participate, especially perhaps in the downstream creation of the ideas that are pursued, but also kind of understanding the balance between, okay, what are we going to do within our company, and where do we harness the power of others to help us deliver all that as well? So again, there's a balance, as I say, but it's a critically important element to understand in the way that modern business is conducted.
Yeah. You mentioned resources, and I recently learned that you and I share someone we both admire, Gary Hamel, management guru, global business professor, of course, who says that groundbreaking ideas happen during times of stretch, not slack, during that gap between aspiration and resources. And so I wanted to ask you a relevant question today, right? During times of uncertainty, crisis, inflation, how can modern enterprises continue to innovate despite the lack of resources during such difficult times, or during expansion and growth as well? Maybe, different settings and scenarios.
It's interesting, Tim. There's a lot of research that shows that some of the best companies, many of the best companies, are born during downturns. Mine was, for example, and in '01, after the first internet bubble burst, and 9/11 happened, of course, in '01 as well. We had all sorts of challenges in those early days. And quite frankly, it's the constraint of that. It's the challenge of that, the crucible of no easy revenue. That ideas are by no means going to be preordained for success, that requires the best thinking to come about in order to succeed. And so I think oftentimes, those challenges and those wins earned during the most difficult times are in many ways that is what determines long-term success. Are you able to see your way through those challenging times? A second point that I would make is I think constraint is your friend. I'll tell you a quick story. I took a group of multi-billion-dollar company tech execs, chief information officers, to visit a startup in California. This is pre-pandemic, so this would have been, I think it was January of 2019, as I recall. Mm-hmm. And it was an augmented reality company. And we met with the executive team. We heard about all the use cases of it. We tried on their headsets and got to live real life some of the use of the technology and seeing the power of it. They were describing their list of customers, and it was most of them massive organizations that they served. And it was interesting, as we got to the conclusion of our conversation, one of the executives I had invited to join us said, "How many members of your team are there?" And it was less than 20. And this executive that asked the question said, "You know what? I'd like to come back here with my leadership team and show them what can be done with 20 people, because I rarely have a project request where members of my team aren't saying we need 50 extra people in order to deliver what you're suggesting is needed." And I think the lesson, as I say, is constraint is in some ways your friend, because constraint forces prioritization, and in many ways is it's a mechanism to determine what really are the most important things for us to pursue now. I think sometimes when we grow our teams to massive scale, the work fits that scale as opposed to the reverse. And sometimes that leads to flabbiness even strategic flabbiness, to be perfectly candid. And so I think it's oftentimes, as I say, the crucible of difficult times that provide the focus for the best companies to hone their craft all the better. So actually, in some ways, the bigger challenge is the last part that you added to the question of during times of growth and where it doesn't feel like anything's broken. I think sometimes it's during those periods where companies really lose their way because they have a false sense of security that feels like it's going to last for the foreseeable future. And it's those other companies that have gone through challenges recently that perhaps are built to steal market share from them as a result of it.
And I remember some examples also from the LinkedIn Learning course where you spoke about ING and its interesting structure. And there's other examples. There's plenty of examples probably in business management. W.L. Gore and Associates, who limits the numbers of business units, the number of people in a particular business unit. Google as well, right? And so
Amazon's two pizza teams, it's another version of that, right? That if you can't feed the team with two pizzas, if two pizzas aren't sufficient, then you've got too many people on the team.
So a general observation also that many of us dilettantes, amateurs who are not experienced in IT, information technology, make is that in the tech industry in particular, it's really the idea or the product that are truly the protagonist rather than its author or the expert responsible, relatively speaking, compared to other industries. And so as a result, there's supposedly a faster rate of innovation in tech than in other industries, possibly more teamwork as well to rally around that MVP, right? Or less politics involved in decision making. Are these assumptions, are these general pictures, are they realistic in terms of teamwork and agility?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that. Certainly, the stereotype is there for a reason, and I think on the one hand, so much of venture capital, for example, is being put towards software companies and technology product organizations, not exclusively, of course, but because so much of it is put there, it leads to an impetus for the need for hyperscaling, right? If Sequoia Capital is going to give $50 million to some startup, well, they better be using that. Sequoia expects a return on that investment and hopefully a significant one. And so that management team needs to be, it has all the focus necessary in order to ensure that they're on a path to very rapid hyperscaling. And of course, most will still fail. That's the nature of VC as well, that it's a batting average more akin to, again, back to the baseball analogy, where if you fail only 70% of the time, you'll make the Hall of Fame. So I think that said, the amount of talent and the amount of money that's being put into the tech space just does in some ways lend itself to ensuring that those companies have very modern practices, modern skill sets, modern processes. Part of it is also, frankly, that so much of enterprise technology, if you think about this, the vast array of companies, so many of them are built relatively recently, certainly in the digital age. So it's the very nature of the age, in fact. And so they don't have quite as much legacy. It's a fallacy to say they don't have any, of course, because legacy is built up very, very quickly indeed. But, I have a number of clients I serve, even great ones, who are using, in some cases, have data flowing through technologies that were implemented before the executives who run that part of the organization were born. And that is a source of risk, needless to say, and it's an impossibility for a modern company. No company would be created today and say, let's go think about 1960s technology that we could begin to implement right now. So I think, there's the advantage of recency. There's the advantage of the vast amount of talent that's pouring into technology is a very, crucial industry where with a lot of ambition, generally speaking. So I think there's a lot that rings true in terms of that stereotype.
We spend a lot of our time virtually. And, I remember during the pandemic when a lot of the conferences in healthcare, for example, became either hybrid or virtual, there was a great variability in terms of creating communities and creating engagement and education. Whereas in the tech industry, there's a lot of data that showed that they outperformed other industries in that regard, right? Even in a virtual communication and virtual meeting space as well. So I think, I've been following the technology space much more in the last few years. And I'm, in fact, starting a first unprecedented cross-company medical affairs innovation Olympics event, kicking off this fall. So it's a huge experiment and a different, very daring kind of format of ideation that we'll be talking about much more in my industry. So we definitely look at technology and information technology as a role model, I think, and there's many qualities to emulate as well. Now, are there particular gaps that you see, and how can the tech industry continue to be a role model for others, for us?
Yeah, well, sure. I think that there is, and again, when you talk about the tech industry generally, needless to say, there's so many different flavors of that we could discuss in terms of talking about gaps. But it's still the case that the technology industry is dominated by males, by men. The founders are still, remarkably a remarkable percentage are men. Just as a remarkable percentage of those funding the companies in venture capital are also men. And so, nothing wrong with men, but having a greater degree of diversity, of course, is I think a worthy pursuit to ensure that there's broader representation of society, generally speaking, in terms of the ideas that are being pursued as the one of the higher aspects of value that's derived from that greater level of diversity. And frankly, even other flavors and important aspects of diversity have a lot of underrepresentation, whether that is racial diversity or sexual orientation or a variety of others that you and I might call out. Again, underrepresentation, I think, in the tech field, generally speaking. Some strides being made, don't get me wrong, but I think that's one of the areas in which the tech industry might emulate others that have made more progress there. As one point. Secondly, I think there's also one wonders, at least I do sometimes, the venture capital community is a remarkable catalyst for innovation. But as I mentioned before, the pressure of receiving capital means that you need to have some kind of exit on the back end in order to provide the return that your funder seeks. So you need to go public at some point or get acquired at some point. There are some VCs that are very patient, that you can go a decade or more in some cases privately before that takes place. But somehow, somewhere, they want to get that return. And so I think that sometimes that path is not necessarily the right one for all organizations, and that push to have that financial event sometimes can be deleterious as well. I mean, there are many companies across all industries, of course, that are public who've gone through their own version of that. And I don't mean to suggest that either being acquired or going public are bad outcomes. But as I say, just because the VC, once you are venture backed, you are sort of getting yourself on the rails that send you down the railroad towards one of those outcomes. It isn't necessarily always the greatest thing. But so anyway, a couple of ideas that come to mind with the question you call out.
Yeah. So we spoke a little bit about competition, how to stay competitive, relevant, innovative, right? The importance of the ecosystem. The way I think of innovation is that the first step to innovation is really creating a platform, right? You don't necessarily have to innovate per se, but if you create a platform, an accelerator, an incubator, right, that's already an important step. In the same way as creating other leaders, right, or mentors, a mentorship program, right, and from my experience. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the impact of IT departments and their roles in culture and people management as well. What are some resources or frames of reference that you can share for IT, within IT, to manage people, their emotions and their lives as well, rather than just their data, right, and their work and technology alone, in this environment in which employees are now changing the world of work and are struggling to continue to be engaged?
Yeah, and I would say it's an interesting question, certainly, Tim. And I would say in many cases, it's the tech team that is most strained during these times. On the one hand, it tends to be one of those organizations that even in a manufacturing organization, for instance, where a great preponderance of employees never could really go virtual because somebody needs to be there to mine the manufacturing plant to produce whatever it is that is being produced. Technology resources, even in companies like that, have had greater flexibility in terms of where they do work. And as there's a push now to go hybrid for many companies, there is a vast number of organizations that have just a lot of employees now that have never, or rarely, let's say, have been in the same room with each other. And so the cultural element you call out, I think, is, if anything, going to become all the more challenged because of the nature of work these days. You referenced earlier the fact that now we're doing so much more virtually than we ever did before. And so I think, in March of 2020, when those of us who could go virtual did, and we did so for our safety, our families, and our colleagues' safety, it wasn't really a question if you had that option. We were lulled into, I think, a false set of security, in as much as things actually worked pretty well on the other end of that. We fired up Zoom, we had meetings, we made sure that the VPN was working appropriately and the appropriate security software was implemented on computers, and we sort of continued where we once were. But the false sense of security actually came from the fact that, almost by definition, everyone who went virtual had been in offices together before. There was that built-in trust and immersion in the culture. There was a shared language that those who went virtual had. Fast forward, and this is going to increasingly be the case, greater and greater percentages, again, by definition, of people that are on the team, again, will never have operated in that form. And oftentimes we're seeing in organizations, the last people to come in are the first to leave because they don't feel like they're part of something bigger than just themselves. And so that really, I think, becomes the challenge. Not just for IT departments, of course, it's for the company generally speaking. But I think it's acute within IT organizations because of the nature of the work, and so much of it can be done virtually. So it does mean being very intentional in terms of, how do you go about collaborating, and what are, frankly, even the reasons for people to come together in order to occupy the same space, like when they collaborate, or when they create, or when they career plan, or when they celebrate, to name a few C's that might be the activities that would bring folks together. I think these are the kinds of defining what kind of work, as opposed to your opinion versus mine. If we can agree, okay, today is a day that we're going to be creating, we're going to be brainstorming for 10 hours. Well, that feels to me, tomorrow, I should say, is going to be that feels to me that you and I ought to be together for that 10-hour session in person around a whiteboard where we can see each other and, kind of get a feeling for the two of us and the others who will be joining our team for that session. If we can agree on the kind of work that is best done in that way, then I think that then all the better in helping us make sure that we have those immersive experiences that become the ties that bind for an organization as well.
Okay. Are there any specific companies or teams that you're advising that have excelled in this transformation?
Those who have been very active in their communications as well as in their change management programs. I would say those are two key elements that determine success. Okay. Regular and clear and open dialogue as to what the current hypotheses are that we are leveraging to determine the state of work as we see it for the foreseeable future, but also recognizing you need good, strong change management programs in place, because a lot of change we've already been through a lot of change, and there will be a lot more to come. Mm-hmm. I recently wrote an article for my Forbes column where I suggested to piggyback on the points just made, that what we experienced in March of 2020 pales in comparison to the challenge of what we have ahead. And a lot of that is because, pre-pandemic, 95, 98% of work was done in an office. It was a given, right? If I joined your company, I'm changing addresses for my business. I may change cities, in fact, as a result of that change. And I don't really have a lot of liberty as a new employee to push back on that. Now, today, everyone has liberty to some extent, even if for a company that says you need to be 5 days in the office. Well, then people will vote with their feet, and they may go elsewhere, because not all companies, in fact, few companies are being as strict as that. And so the fact that all flavors are there are some people who can't wait to return to an office because they live in an efficiency apartment with a spouse and a dog and a child, let's say, and they need some peace and quiet, to others who have a special wing where no one bothers them where they do work and they don't ever want to come into an office again, and every flavor in between. And so I think it's those people who recognize and have very open dialogue with their employees, but also prepare them for the fact that the hypotheses that the current state are based upon, some are going to be incorrect. And so what we say is the sort of state of work today isn't necessarily where we will be in 18 or 24 or 36 months. We need to continue to evaluate anecdotal evidence from our people, but also the data that proves how well we are working together, and course correct along the way. So that preparation, that communication is, I think, essential as well. And those companies that get that right tend to be the ones who are building trust, even in a largely virtual environment with their employees.
Yeah, and the need to communicate and just create that sense of belonging is also, I think, underlined by a lot of the recent data that I've seen, Peter, where there's a 70% difference between the executives' level of engagement and the rank and file employees. And I think this, the talk of the Great Resignation is what I call the Great Revelation. I think that it's not just that we are finding ourselves more efficient at working virtually, but maybe perhaps it's that we don't feel like we belong or we're involved in those decisions, right, firsthand. And that's why it's really the executives who are calling and asking for their employees to go back to the office. But those who work on the front lines, 2/3 or 3/4 of them are choosing to work virtual or have that option. So, if you consider your organization a family, then once the restrictions are lifted, then wouldn't you naturally try to go back and kind of hug your family and be with them in the office? I think so. It's some of the data I think is very telling. Again, highlights the need for better, more direct, transparent communication. I think that you brought up that kind of.
The fair points all.
Yeah, and so speaking of some of the recent evidence that I've seen that I'm curious for your perspectives about, Peter, there's recent studies that have been published that have showed that many different employers and industries began to use data to monitor the employees in what they termed the worker productivity score. I've seen some recent articles, and which has backfired for many companies in many regards, as employees have shown to be more likely to express those very behaviors that are prohibited when they know that they're being monitored. So there are different ways we can use technology and security. And I've seen it firsthand among many employees in my industry who love the nature of their job, but as soon as they know that they're monitored, they choose to use their own personal cell phone rather than a company phone, for example. So how do you interpret such results, and what recommendations do you have in applying the new technology, to guide decisions that impact our employees?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all fair points as well. I mean, I think people who run companies deserve to know how productive their teams are, but the methods that are used to evaluate that and the methods used to collect the data are going to be different for different organizations. And I think in some cases, it's an ongoing dialogue from manager to managed, if you will, and perhaps to some extent sort of anecdotal. And that's imperfect, of course. What it makes attractive, the possibility of monitoring, who's online when and what are they doing when, and when are they using their phone versus their computer, et cetera, and drawing distinctions based upon that. The beauty of that is that it takes the person out of it, that there are programs that are evaluating that provide, percentages and means of evaluating things that can be quite compelling. But as you point out, especially if it's done surreptitiously without the knowledge of employees and somehow that's found out, obviously that can backfire tremendously. And in fact, even being transparent about it, as you call out, can have its own issues as well. And so I think part of it is having an ongoing dialogue with the team that, look, we all owe each other productivity, of course. Different organizations will determine what form that takes. I mean, some have great liberty. You work the hours you want, but get this done. Like we agree this is due on Wednesday, whether you're doing that, after the kids are in bed or, different hours than the typical work hours during the day is up to you. Whereas others will say, look, we all should be working at the same time because in that way I can reach out to you and know that you'll be in a position to take a call from me or answer a question or just engage in a dialogue when necessary. So different organizations will take different stances. But I think having a very human aspect to it, an ongoing dialogue as to the rationale for the necessity to just make sure that we're all kind of living up to what we owe each other in our jobs is an important dialogue to maintain.
What are some of your personal recommendations to CIOs regarding these trends of type B corporations, of integrating corporate social responsibility or responsible AI, for example, into training and policies into their business?
Having a better understanding of the broader implications of the decisions you make, I think, are really important. Taking those in order, social responsibility. You think about ESG type aspects to businesses. Technology has a big role to play in all of that, and quite frankly, the extent to which you are hiring people who are younger, they're going to be compelled or not based upon how well articulated your thoughts are on those very topics. We hear so much more that the younger you are, the more you are kind of mission driven, that people will accept jobs for less compensation if they feel tied to and feel like they really are a part of the mission that's being driven, for example. And so a lot of that boils down to having a well-articulated plan relative to some of these points. So I would say like getting ahead of that and burnishing your own credentials and highlighting what you've envisioned for the future on some of these subjects becomes important for those reasons, among others. They're important for the prima facie reasons relative to those very ideas, but the ancillary benefits of also motivating and attracting great people, which is the lifeblood of any business, are also not to be, it can't be underscored enough. When it comes to responsible artificial intelligence and the downstream implications to investments made in technologies like those, again, I think, a note of caution needs to be there. Recognizing the limitations of those are really important as well. I have a friend who, he's now holds the title of chief digital officer of a big company. He talks about how when you put algorithms in place, when you're implementing artificial intelligence that is doing whatever it is that you are doing, whatever you've assigned it to do, you ought to give it a review almost like an employee on a regular basis and figure out which algorithms are succeeding and which are failing, and promoting some and firing others. So he really kind of uses that analogy in a really interesting way. And the idea is don't set it and forget it, but rather think about, how well is this working in the grand scheme of things? Just because you can measure something, just because you can put together an algorithm, just because it then does develop an analysis for you, doesn't mean it's the right analysis, doesn't mean it's helping you make better decisions. And so going through the critical aspects of determining the efficacy of those efforts and course correcting accordingly become very important.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought those points, and I think we have a lot to learn as leaders from the next generation and new leaders entering the workforce. So we talked a little bit about the productivity as well, and so that brings us probably to performance metrics, right? How do you measure productivity or efficiency and innovation? And one of the ways I think you can predict success now is becoming a digitally mature company, which was a term that I learned first from you, from your course. What are those different stages, first, of becoming a digitally mature company?
Yeah, easier said than done. I think the phrase digital transformation is thrown around oftentimes without a full cognizance of what it means. There really are stages, as you imply, which are covered in my course. Thank you so much for noting that, my LinkedIn Learning course on digital transformation. And so if you think about it in its most basic forms, the first form is digitization, which is taking traditional information that your company has, whether for internal uses or external uses, and digitizing that. Some people, it's thankfully it's less the case today, but for a while it was believed that was kind of a digital transformation. But if your digital realm and your traditional realm of your business are operating in parallel, never the two to meet, the value you're getting in the combination is lost. A good example of this is the Washington Post, my hometown paper, but of course an international media organization. They developed a digital, like so many media properties, developed a digital version of itself 20 years ago or so, got a different office for them in a different part of, in fact, it was Northern Virginia, as opposed to the headquarters, which was in the district for the Post itself. And, had young staff and sexy workspace and all these sorts of things. But what they were in essence doing was taking kind of the information from the periodical and rendering it digitally and not doing much more besides that in those initial stages. True digital transformation means the combination of those things. The guy who runs technology now and also product for the company is a gentleman named Shailesh Prakash, a wonderful leader. He's been in role for over a decade now. And he recognized the necessity to really take those parallel lines and cross them, and brought the digital staff back to headquarters, immerse them in all that the organization does. So having kind of, reporters and pundits and writers of various kinds working directly with the digital team to make sure that they are getting the word out, getting news out, and interacting with the readers in more compelling ways and in different forms, whether it's video and audio, in addition to traditional written word, of course, and finding new ways to make the news immersive for those who are reading it. Once you get to that level where the entire organization thinks digitally, that's really when true digital transformation takes place. And so it really becomes, one of the signs, frankly, Tim, is when you have, I think during the period of transition, you'll have marketing and digital marketing. You'll have, sales and digital sales. Once those become the same thing and you don't have a distinction between the two, you're on the path at least to true digital transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. And in our function in medical affairs, we now have the operations department, which is growing, which you previously saw mostly in commercial or marketing. Because in the marketing departments have a different revenue, and medical affairs is non-revenue generating function that is essentially involved in generating and disseminating information. So it's in the business of information during the age of information. And now we're finding ourselves having to communicate in different ideas across different channels as well. And so that operations is becoming ever so relevant to us. One example that you speak about in your interviews of a function which combines both domain expertise with operations and with the workflow is DevOps, right? In IT and in technology. So what makes the DevOps specialty in technology companies an important case study to learn from for us, for example, in medical, in pharma, or in other industries?
In its most basic form, it's a great question, because I think it really is a emblematic of change that needs to happen across all aspects of the organization. So DevOps is simply a portmanteau between development and operations. And in a technology setting, the idea is that there's certain people who are involved in the creation of something, taking it from zero to prototype and to working model. And then there are those who then manage it once it is up and running. And so once a product is released, then you've got a team who only then engages to make sure that it continues to run and do what it is that it's doing in various ways. The difficulty with that, the assumption was those are two different styles of work, two different skill sets, and a logic then to keep people sort of isolated in those areas or domains where they operate best. But the problem is there's a lot of friction, and there's a lot that's lost, frankly, in the sort of tossing over the wall from one team to another with the graduation of idea and prototype to working model and working product, again, in whatever form that might take. And it's been realized that including the people who will be operating it in the earliest stages with those who are developing things actually pays enormous dividends in terms of, ensuring that it's working and functioning well, that you are taking into consideration like security. In fact, in some ways, in many cases, the portmanteau has been extended to DevSecOps for security there in the middle. That you're thinking further about, the downstream implications to what's being developed at the outset. And so I think the broader trend to bear in mind that this is representative of is making these traditional silos of business more permeable. You're still going to have a marketing department, operations organization, a tech division, et cetera. It's not like those go away, but the silos that encompass each of those need to become permeable silos where resources are going across each of those, and collaborations are being formed in ways that perhaps they weren't in the past. And so any opportunities to bring together uncommon bedfellows, so to say, to experiment together, to ideate together, and in fact, even to develop products together, and even in many cases, the whole notion of product teams, which bring together team members from across those different disciplines with an ongoing responsibility to refine and innovate around those ideas. Let me just take as an example, order to cash. That's a process area, a value stream most private sector organizations have in one way, shape, or form. If you assemble a team with the various disciplines necessary in order to innovate around the process of going from order to cash, to continue to you make that more efficient, more user friendly, efficient from the perspective of getting cash in the door, et cetera, then you can actually have those teams you assemble can innovate in a different kind of way and develop different kinds of ideas, in fact, that make them more powerful, more applicable. So I think this applies across the organization, and wherever you can foster those unusual collaborations, so much the better.
Great. I really appreciate that advice. And I think also what I take away from some of your description there is the introspection, right? So the people who are directly responsible for the work are then forced to be a little bit more introspective, right, and reflective of their operations.
Great point.
Right. Yeah, because the expectations or metrics that we have in business are driven by the norms of communication and the workflow that we ourselves create as well. So I would love to ask this question, and for, I'm curious about your opinion about, how do we create those types of performance metrics or the kinds of contests that matter in a competitive ecosystem, whether or not we are generating revenue as a department or we're not, let's say, as in the case of medical in pharma or other departments that I'm sure you've observed. What are some trends and some like guidelines or frameworks that you would share when we design those KPIs and contests, competitions?
Yeah, well, I mean, Tim, ultimately, you want to have innovation. It's kind of funny. Innovation is one of those topics that sometimes people know when they see it, but don't necessarily know how to evaluate that and measure that. And I would say, in many cases, it is an ongoing evaluation of the percentage of revenue that's derived for something that was created in some sort of recent time frame. Maybe it's the past 12 months, past 2 years, something like that. That you want to have a pipeline to your ideas such that you don't have a complacency to where you're earning your revenue. That you don't have 99% of your revenue earned on products or services developed 10 years ago, let's say, as to take a very stark, dramatic example. That would certainly suggest the competitors are probably out innovating you in one way, shape, or form. So part of it is that recency, that you're continuing to drive new kinds of value in the recent time horizon and have a mechanism in place in order such that is an ongoing fulfillment and proof of value as time goes on. Mm-hmm. I think, interestingly enough, harkening back to the earlier point of the necessity to have, the recognition that you're not going to bat 1,000 if you're innovating. It's also, frankly, evaluating the number of ideas that you're putting out into the world that are not succeeding. I'm not suggesting, of course, that it's a great thing that you put 100 ideas out into the world in the last 12 months and 100 of them failed, right? There's no pride in that. But I think, understanding, how are we at developing new ideas, of taking a lot of turns, to the plate and taking a lot of swings, forgive a lot of baseball analogies throughout the interview, but that I think it's important for us to evaluate that and not necessarily have too much consternation in recognizing that some of those are not going to be successful. We of course want our batting average to stay high and improve it, but we also need to make sure that we are not holding ourselves to a standard such that, if an idea doesn't prove fruitful, that we are failures as a team. It's always opportunities for learning and not failing, hopefully the same way in the future, but rather taking that learning forward in new, constructive ways. Mm-hmm. So those are not an exhaustive list, Tim, sure, but a couple of things that come to mind.
Yeah. Peter, I want to tell you that we share yet another thing that I just discovered. I also have used baseball analogies, believe it or not. Right? And I enjoy writing. I have quite a lot of blog articles and LinkedIn articles. And probably the most frequently cited one is one where I used this baseball analogy to talk about performance metrics in my function. So I personally appreciate them. The second comment that I wanted to make also is that those ideas, one of the reasons why in my last in-weekend newsletter, I made a bold statement that, I think the strongest, most innovative leaders follow ideas, not people. because that allows them to not take offense to criticism, to provide more feedback, and also to be able to share a lot of different parts of ideas from various different people, and therefore come up with their own diverse set of approaches and platforms. And so that, to me, is how ideas become the protagonists, and really help us communicate and create that psychological safety as well. So I really appreciated your comments about the batting average, and the fact that, look, yeah, 1,000, 100 of those 100 ideas may not be successful, but maybe taking parts of them may create a masterpiece in the next year, right?
So, well said. Very well said.
I have one last question that I want to ask, and that has to do with disruption, which a lot of CIOs and chief technology officers, I think, are accustomed to, probably more than others in other industries, right? And so, what, amidst this fast pace of information and how much information and how fast it travels, how do chief information officers, IT departments, leave a legacy across their ideas that may even outlive them, right? Like Andy Warhol said, that the idea is not to live forever, but to leave ideas that will. So what is the legacy of the next generation, most modern CIOs?
Yeah, so I think, Tim, I will say I think it is really the ideas they put in place. Now, technology is so fast paced, it will not necessarily be the tech solutions themselves, because you don't have to go too many years out to know that the state of art today is going to be what's on the trash heap in a decade. And so I think in many ways, it's a philosophy more than anything else. It's a desire to constantly innovate, as we talked about before, press, push the boundaries of what can be accomplished in our industries, building great teams. And actually, if you ask me for a single response to that, it is the family tree we leave behind. What I mean by that, Tim, is how many people were once reports of ours who have gone on to lead other organizations. I think I know a number of people who are chief information officers who have a dozen or even more chief information officers of other companies who once reported to them, and they take enormous pride out of that. I think in building that kind of skill set for the future, that is, I think, in many ways, the greatest legacy we can leave.
Thank you so much, Peter. I've truly enjoyed our conversation. It's been an honor. I hope that a lot of those who will listen will follow the Technovation podcast, will read Getting to Nimble, your latest book. And I look forward to continuing our dialogue. If you have a final message to all our coach listeners, where the slogan is stretch yourself, lift others, I'd like to leave the last word to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's been a wonderful conversation. I think what you're facilitating here is so incredibly valuable, because in this day and age where the pace of change has never been so fast, and yet it's the slowest it will be from this point forward, it requires that all of us be lifelong learners. And so the extent to which we have the gift that you're providing, among others, of learning from others along the way and drawing upon those for the kinds of changes we need to continue to incorporate into our organizations, we will all be better for it.
Thank you so much, Peter. Have a great day.
Thank you again. You too.